What do you think is harder to escape, a locked basement or a justice system that's been bought? When I was 13, I crawled out a basement window to escape an abusive stepfather, only to stand before a judge who was his college buddy, who ordered family reunification and sent me back, until his daughter secretly recorded the bribe and the feds raided the poker table. This is the story of how I survived of the adults who dared to step up from a librarian to a girl named Melissa, and how one small window can open a way out for many other kids. Chapter 1: The Basement Window. That night, the night I escaped home, began with the sound of paper tearing. He stood in front of my desk, calmly ripping my chemistry book page after page as if he were folding shirts. Lights out at 9. Which part do you not understand? His voice was always low, even never raised. It was that quiet that scared me. I told him I had a test in the morning. He nodded as if noting it in a planner. 3 days without food. Helps you remember longer? Then he shoved me down to the basement. The punishment room was a storage space, concrete floor, no heat, the damp smell of old cardboard boxes. The padlock snapped shut right above my head. I sat at the bottom of the stairs, counting my heartbeat until I couldn't tell if it was my pulse or the whine of the house vents. I had, in truth, been preparing for a long time. Ever since he shoved my mother and she tumbled down a few steps and she told the neighbor she had tripped, I knew no one was coming to save us. So every time I was locked in, I loosened one screw on the tiny window frame near the ceiling, bit by bit, like running the longest experiment of my life. Close to 3 in the morning, I lay still and listened to the steady whir of his breathing machine through the floorboards. Mom had likely sunk into her anxiety meds, her way of surviving each day. I sprang up, stretched to the sill, and pushed at the frame I'd loosened. Each metal squeal felt like a needle up my spine. The window gave. I gritted my teeth and slid a shoulder through the gap just wide enough for a skinny 13-year-old. I brought nothing heavy, only the backpack I'd prepared, a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, my birth certificate lifted from Mom's file drawer, and the $280 I'd saved, tutoring little kids at the library. Mrs. Tanaka paid cash and never asked about the round marks on my arms. Night wind threaded through my shirt as I belly crawled onto the back lawn. I lay flat for a few seconds, ear to the ground, listening for footsteps. Nothing but crickets. I crawled past the fence, avoided the security cams, and cut across the unlit lawns of the suburbs houses, so safe-looking they could be on a brochure. I knew I couldn't go to a friend's place. Too obvious. I couldn't go to the community center. More cameras than our house. I headed for the one place I knew as well as my own hand, school. Behind the gym building, there was an iron gate with a broken hinge no one bothered to fix. I slipped through, tiptoed along the brick wall to the sports equipment shed. The brittle plastic lock gave with a single twist. In the corner, the sleeping bag I'd stashed the week before was still there. I slid in and pulled the zipper to my chin. The cold from the concrete crept into my spine, but it was still kinder than the basement chill, where silence meant waiting. At dawn, I was up before the custodian. The sink in the athletics wing restroom was enough to wash my face, comb my hair, scrub the dirt from my sleeves. I took my seat like any other day, did my work like any other day. No one asked anything because the quiet, straight A kid who turns in assignments on time is assumed to be fine. Mid-period, I looked down at my arms, faded circular burn marks, like punctuation marks in a story I had never been allowed to tell, or been. I rolled my sleeves back down, wrote formulas, took notes as usual. In the row ahead, a classmate read a passage aloud. The teacher smiled. I smiled too, as if everything were fine. At lunch, I went back to the equipment shed and finished the stale sandwich from yesterday. I took a sheet of paper from my backpack and reviewed it, a list of what to keep if I had to run again, documents, cache, alternate routes around the neighborhood to avoid cameras. I tucked librarian Mrs. Nakamura's business card into my small notebook like a charm. She was one of the few who looked me in the eyes when I checked out books. Maybe because she knew the difference between ordinary quiet and a quiet that was calling for help. At night, I drifted to the bleachers by the field and tipped my face up to the cloudless sky. Somewhere a dog barked, then cut off. I thought about our dog made to sleep outside the winter before, to build character, and by morning, just a stiff lump on the stoop. Adults have endless other names for cruelty. The first night passed, then the second. I learned to shower fast in the locker room to wash shirts under the faucet and dry them under the hand dryer. I picked up extra tutoring hours at the library and slid each bill into the lining of my backpack. I practiced disappearing in crowds, walking at the right pace, nodding at the right times, offering just enough of a smile. I thought I was free. I thought if I stayed quiet, worked hard, went to school like nothing had happened, it would be enough. I didn't yet know that a single buzz from a phone during literature class would make the whole room look up at once and my face would show on their screens. But that was tomorrow's problem. That night in the shed that held rackets and balls, I pulled the sleeping bag up to my nose and whispered to myself, I'm still breathing. And the window opened this time. I closed my eyes, hugged my backpack, the sum total of what was mine, and let the wind seep through the seams of the corrugated metal, singing a lullaby to a child who had just learned how to save herself. Chapter 2. 2 weeks. Invisible and the phone. Buzz. I thought I could live invisible forever. Mornings, I arrived earlier than the custodian, washed up in the locker room, dried shirts under the hand dryer, then sat properly at my desk like a diligent student. At lunch, I hid in the bleachers. At night, I crawled back into the equipment shed. My work stayed complete. My grades stayed high. At school, if you turn things in on time, people assume you're fine. On one of those something teen days, I was sitting in literature when the whole room buzzed at once. 100 phones lit up like fireflies. Amber alert. My name. My photo. Missing child. Possible abduction. I pulled my hood, low eyes glued to my novel. By afternoon, the local news aired him holding my mother, his voice cracking at all the right moments. Please bring our son home. We just want him safe. I watched Mom's lips pressed tight, her eyes empty as if the meds had scraped her clean from the inside. The next day was worse. Hallways were full of glances that flicked from screens to my face. I ate lunch in the bathroom, chewing a hard, dry sandwich just to get it down. After class, I drifted into the library, the only quiet place, and the place I'd kept living thanks to tutoring hours. I slipped to the back of the biography stacks, leaned against a shelf, and fell asleep without noticing. I woke to a figure blotting out the light. The librarian stood there, arms full of new books. She looked at me long enough to recognize me. I saw it in her eyes, the pieces reconnecting. She didn't scold, didn't call anyone. She only said, very softly, Kenji, come into my office. I followed her, my mind already plotting a run out the back door if it all went bad. She shut the door, lowered the blinds, and sat across from me. Are you safe at home? A simple question, like offering a key. I almost lied. Then I rolled up my sleeve. The round marks like cigarette tips, some old, some new. I lifted the back of my shirt, showed her the belt, welts purple through layers of time. There's more, I said quietly, but this should be enough. She didn't call parents. She called social services. And while we waited, she handed me her lunchbox, 3 small rice balls and a few orange segments. It was my first real meal in days. I ate slowly so I wouldn't cry. A social worker showed up, fast camera forms, questions a recorder. For the first time, adults believed me from the start. An investigator said they had obtained a warrant to search the house. By evening, he came back and set a bag of evidence in front of me. Photos of the basement wall, streaked with the blood I'd clawed there, the bucket in the corner used as a toilet, my mother's hospital records with dozens of injuries that didn't add up. We found everything, he said. He'll be in cuffs today. That night I sat in the librarian's office holding her hand, As we watched the news, my stepfather passing a camera in a crisp dress shirt, both wrists pressed together in front of his belly. I thought it's over. She looked at me and smiled faintly. Open and shut case, the prosecutor told us over the phone, clear as day. I was placed with a temporary foster family, a kind couple who smiled often, tucking extra pillows on the bed as if afraid I'd run short on softness. They sat at the end of the dinner table and asked what I liked to eat, whether I had any allergies, whether I'd like to keep a plant in my room for fun. I nodded along because my head held only one thought court day. I would say everything, show photos, show video, show the scars. People would listen, the law would do the rest. The hearing came faster than I expected. The librarian sat right behind me, the foster family on either side, the social worker across. I looked around the courtroom, practiced steady breaths, my hands ice cold despite June. When the back door opened, the judge walked in. Everyone rose, then sat. I looked up, and my heart dropped to my feet. I knew that face. It appeared in every frame covering the wall of my stepfather's study, graduation fishing trips, some championship trophy 30 years ago. He looked straight at me and smiled like greeting an old acquaintance. I gripped the seat. The prosecutor's words echoed in my head, a sure thing. Right then, I understood some things are certain until they meet a handshake that's been around 3 decades. And the next chapter of this story would not be as simple as I had dreamed. Chapter 3: The Courtroom and the Familiar Smile. He wore the gavel of the law the way you wear an old graduation cap, polite, polished and fitted perfectly to the past. When the judge walked in and smiled straight at me, I knew the open and shut case had just dissolved like smoke. It was the face that covered the walls of my stepfather's study, college buddy, fishing partner brothers for 30 years. Upon review, he said warm, and even the court orders immediate family reunification. I didn't hear the rest. The word reunification slammed into my head like the basement door slamming shut. The wooden bench beneath me turned into concrete floor. Behind me, the librarian shot to her feet. She spoke up loudly, demanding he recuse himself for a conflict of interest. The bailiffs rushed in, hands already extended as if on a familiar cue. The prosecutor rifled through a stack of files for a conflict of interest form that wasn't there. The judge smiled kindly. A friend of a friend isn't a legal conflict, ma'am. In the corner, my stepfather adjusted his tie. The corner of his mouth twitched, a tiny twitch, small enough for the camera to catch, but not the people. Under the table, my foster mother's hand touched mine. "We'll appeal," she whispered. The social worker was already waiting with a thick packet transition paperwork, as if this decision had been printed in advance. I had a few seconds to choose scream and become the unstable kid they were constructing, or swallow it and wait for another opening. I chose to swallow. I asked to use the restroom. The social worker glanced at the file and hesitated. My legal guardian had changed 5 minutes earlier. My stepfather stood up slowly. "I'll take him." In the hallway, his hand landed on the old spot on my shoulder, familiar pressure leaving no mark. In the stall, he straightened my collar, voice low like a prayer. "Everything will be like before." Back in the courtroom, I saw the school paper's reporter standing near the door. He was the type who always ate lunch alone. Our eyes met for a second. I shaped the word, help. He blinked, gave the faintest nod, then turned away. The social worker went on reading the reunification requirements: new house already purchased, old house being sold, a finished soundproofed basement for music practice. I felt my stomach drop. On the drive back, Beethoven's Fifth filled the air, the piece he always blasted on nights of discipline. I set my hands on my thighs and held them very still so my heart wouldn't show through. The new house looked like every other safe house on the block, trimmed grass, white painted doorhouse numbers lit up. Inside, it was staged like a catalog and monitored like a lab. "For safety after you ran away," he said, opening an app on his phone. Every room was a little blinking camera tile. My room had been recreated exactly except for one detail: The desk turned with its back to the window, a countdown timer set squarely on top. 1 hour of study lights out at 9. An automatic lock bolted straight into the door, programmed to throw at 21:00. I tested the windows as I carried my backpack in. The paint was thick as concrete. The new locks gleamed key only. He turned the key with a click, hooked it to the chain around his neck, and smiled. Lesson learned. No more climbing out windows. A card slipped from my backpack, Mrs. Nakamura's business card. He picked it up, read every line, and slid it into his pocket. No outside contact during the reunification period, he repeated evenly. I recited her number in my head until it was printed there like a formula. Mom arrived an hour late, straight from the treatment facility. She hugged me in the doorway, limp, her whispered words stumbling. Don't fight. Don't fight. The smell of medication was sharp as alcohol. Fresh bandage peeked from under her cuff. Dinner was laid out 3 place settings pristine. He lifted a glass of water to a family whole again. My mother's lips moved to echo it like a memorized line. The phone rang over dessert, the principal calling about a reunification plan. He took it immediately, voice rounded and warm. I'll do drop-off and pick-up. No extracurriculars, no tutoring until he's rebuilt trust. Everything wrapped in a perfect script. When he hung up, he turned to me. School. Tomorrow. A good boy should keep busy. That night, right at 9, I heard the click of the electric bolt. The ceiling light faded, leaving only the red dot of a camera above like a star that never blinks. I lay on my back and ran through every exit, every camera blind spot, every one of his habits. I pressed my palm to the desktop and felt the cool wood go straight into bone. I remembered the old basement window frame, the screech of metal when the screws finally gave. This time there would be no screws to loosen. I pulled the blanket up and listened to the safe house breathe. Footsteps passed by, paused at my door, then receded. In the next room, my mother sometimes gave a small moan, like someone tugging at a sleeper from inside a dream. I closed my eyes and pictured a library with wide-open windows, the smell of new paper, a warm adult hand gripping mine as we watched the cuffs on the screen. I didn't know how to get back there. I only knew I had to live long enough to figure it out. Tomorrow I would go to school as the saved child. I would nod, smile, turn my work in on time, and learn the red eye pattern of the newly mounted cameras. I would count every minute of chemistry, every door opening and closing in the halls. And as I would wait for the slightest nod, a hastily folded note, a symbol drawn in the margin, anything to remind me someone still believed me. On the first night in a room with an automatic lock overhead, I whispered to myself, like I had in the cold shed behind the field, I'm still breathing. And if there are no screws left to loosen, I'll learn to open locks another way. Chapter 4, The Return and the Invisible Net. The next morning he took me to school as if it were a small ceremony. His hand pressed my shoulder with that familiar force, his smile perfectly calibrated for the gate guard. The boy ran away. He said loud enough for the guard to hear, "The family is in reunification." The guard nodded, pulled out a clipboard, and wrote my name on a list. I watched the fresh ink spread watch list. So tidy. From now on, every step I took would have a recorder. The hallway looked no different from yesterday, but I noticed the new thing's dome cameras mounted on the ceiling, a red light blinking gently in every corner. Classroom doors stood open. Some teachers leaned on the frames, eyes tracking the flow of students like head counters at a stockyard. "Welcome back." My teacher smiled, the kind of smile of someone who's been briefed that I'm a sensitive case. I nodded as if I believed it. At my locker, I found a quarter-folded note tucked in the vent. I glanced around, slid it out, opened it slowly, like a risky experiment. Unfamiliar handwriting, only a few words. "Your story matters. Teacher Alliance." Below was a little book symbol, the same mark Mrs. Nakamura uses to tag her favorites. I crumpled the paper and pushed it deep into my pocket. So there were still adults who used their eyes, not just cameras. First period, the teacher handed back last week's homework. At the bottom of my page was a detail not in the syllabus, a squiggly parent signature next to a note. Thank you for supporting discipline and structure. His handwriting. He had slipped into the margins of my notebook, into the contact log, into the school's voice. I pressed my lips together, nodded thanks, like it was normal for a 13-year-old to volunteer for discipline. In chemistry, the teacher announced new lab partners for the term. I scanned the list and saw my name next to someone I'd never spoken to, Melissa Chen. She sat down beside me, hair neatly tied, eyes curious but polite. My dad says you're lucky, she said as we adjusted the test tubes to be given a second chance. I smiled on reflex, but my heart dipped when she added, my dad's a judge. Cold swept my spine. Nothing was random anymore. Here, even your lab partner could be a relationship. Melissa didn't seem malicious. She talked about ordinary things, her upcoming piano recital, a family trip in the works, the poker nights her dad hosts for friends. She mentioned him, my stepfather, casually as one of the poker group. She laughed that lately he'd been on a hot streak. Winning big, she shrugged. One night, my dad even joked, "Wanna bet custody, too?" She laughed, not knowing why my hand trembled slightly as I poured the solution. I set the graduated cylinder down and drew a deep breath. Information is power. And sometimes power arrives in the innocent voice of a girl who doesn't yet know how many locks her house has. At recess, I passed the library. The checkout desk was quiet. A temporary placard hung over the librarian's name. I hesitated a second, then walked on. She wasn't here today. Maybe the image of her leaping up in court had traveled back to the school, faster than any newscast. Another woman sat in her chair, head down, over returns. When I brought a book back, she looked up and made a very small gesture as she pointed to the name line. Her index finger touched the edge of the cover, then tapped twice. Familiar but strange, very much like the way Mrs. Nakamura once taught me to tell safe people. I answered with a light pencil tap on the counter. She blinked once enough for me to understand someone had taken the shift. At lunch, I wasn't allowed to sit in my usual corner. The supervision table was planted dead center in the cafeteria, aimed straight at a camera. My tray held what he had packed, cut to magazine spec samples, sandwich apple granola bar. I bit in. It tasted like paper. Overhead, a tinny speaker announced after-school clubs. I wasn't allowed in any, he'd told the principal. Around me, kids passed by, glanced once, then looked away, like seeing a caution wet paint sign. At day's end, I stood at the gate, waiting for the car. Afternoon sun made the yellow curb paint glare. A woman walked past. I recognized Mrs. Tanaka, who used to pay cash when I tutored her kid at the library. She walked straight on without looking at me, but spoke into her phone loud enough for my ear. My husband doesn't want to be involved. We'll pause the tutoring. The situation's too sensitive. Another door closed so quietly I almost said thanks for shutting it so neatly. That evening, he opened the camera app to show me like a presentation. For safety, he repeated, "We all want what's best for you." I nodded, letting my eyes roam the little tiles, living room, kitchen, hallway, my room. Mom sat at the table. Eyes fogged a line of prescription bottles standing like sentries. The label bore a new doctor's name, Harrison. I'd seen that name in his club directory, friend of a friend. The net wasn't just cameras. It was people, lab coats, gavels, ties, piano keys, playing cards. The countdown clock on my desk ticked each second like a tiny insect. I did the homework, wrote enough, turned it in on time, let the system lull itself to sleep. But in my head, I started redrawing the map, not of the house like last time, but of relationships. The judge's name, the doctor's name, poker nights, the older brother in construction, the position of the substitute librarian, the school paper kid who eats alone, Mrs. Tanaka, turning away, the gate guard with the clipboard, who does what, when, and in what voice. Night fell. The lock on the door clicked at 9:00 on the dot. I lay still, watching the red dot on the ceiling. In the dark, I could hear my heart more clearly than Beethoven bouncing off the walls in daylight. I recited a different formula, not a chemical reaction, but the equation of power evidence. Plus witnesses, plus a conduit, timing. One term missing, one in hand, one newly revealed by Melissa's piano and poker story. Tomorrow I would go to class as a child, given a second chance. I'd lift my collar when I passed a camera, dip my head when teachers looked, smile when smiling was required. And when Melissa shared another ordinary bit, I'd listen as if memorizing a solo names, schedules, habits, jokes. Because sometimes to break a lock, you can't see, you don't need a screwdriver, you need to know who holds the key and which table they like to play at. Chapter 5. Gathering the Pieces, Living Evidence. On the third day since family reunification, I decided I needed something sturdier than fear facts. Not feelings, not memories, something I could lay on the table like a color change in a test tube right in front of the adults. In computer class, everyone was doing 10-finger typing drills. I plugged headphones into the machine and opened a tiny window on a screen full of icons, my old cloud drive. Hidden among last year's homework files was a perfectly ordinary named video just in case.mp4. I opened it, muted it, scrubbed to the middle. My mother's face appeared bruised but clear-eyed in a way I rarely saw. She held her wrist up to the lens, pointed to the blue-green marks, spoke the dates, and listed each fall. Evidence, not a story. I copied the file onto a slim USB stick hidden in the lid of my pocket calculator. He might search my backpack, my wallet, even take apart my shoes, but he wouldn't think about the calculator he made me use to do math on time. Done. I wiped the browser. History changed the wallpaper and went back to typing as if nothing had happened. My heart was pounding so hard I worried the computer's mic could pick it up. Mid-morning, the counselor called me in. Mandatory session for the reunification phase, she said, in the gentle voice of someone with a report form ready. Her room smelled of orange essential oil and had a small cactus. She asked if I was sleeping, if I had thoughts of running again, if I was self-harming. I knew every answer would land in a file for the court, so I gave her exactly the version the system wanted. I'm grateful for a second chance. Things are getting better. The new bruises hidden where no one photographs kept their own rhythm under my sleeves. In chemistry, I decided on a small gamble. Reaching for a test tube, I let my sleeves slide back a little. The purple bruises spread like wine under glass. Melissa saw. Her eyes widened and then closed at once, like someone tucking a secret note into a notebook. She was quieter than usual. All period. At the end, she said just one offhand line. Tomorrow night we've got poker again at my place. It dropped as casually as a weather report, but I heard an appointment ticking inside it. That night he did a safety check. He flipped through every backpack pocket, counted every sheet of paper, ran his fingers along every seam. He lifted the pocket calculator, turned it over, pressed a few buttons. I held my breath like waiting for an experiment result. Then he put it down and kept rummaging. The USB had been in my shoe lining since recess. 3 steps ahead. Always 3 steps ahead. The next morning, a temporary sign hung on the library board. Mrs. Nakamura was barred from campus while the matter was hot. I stood still at the counter. The substitute librarian, Ms. Chen, looked up, touched the edge of a cover with her index finger, and tapped twice. I answered with a pencil tap like a Morse signal. No one said it, but the message was clear. The network of decent adults was still here. Remember to add a sources section to your essay, she said loudly enough for anyone to hear, leaning on the word sources like blinking lights. I nodded. I was gathering sources. At home, my mother's bottles stood in a straight line like soldiers. I read the labels, dosage tripled from last time Dr. Harrison's name, in bold. At dinner, her eyes drifted like fish in soup, then flicked on and off like a loose bulb. I stood at the sink, doing dishes, calculating. 1 pill fewer each day, not enough to draw attention, enough to crack a sliver for her to speak more clearly. Helping her might get me discovered early. Not helping, and I'd lose my most important witness. I chose the risk. At night, the countdown clock hit 0000 and the door latched itself. I lay there watching the red dot on the ceiling. I thought about the pieces I had my mother's video, the bruises I'd deliberately let show, the library signal, the poker schedule at the judge's house. What was missing? A secure line to people who don't share his golf course. A name, a room number, a hand that wouldn't shake when yanking down the happy family curtain. Next recess, the school paper reporter walked past me in the hall. No glance, no stop, just stuffed a napkin into my hand. Inside was a small, nameless card with a phone number and 3 words, Federal Building, room 342. Blue ink, shaky from haste. I tucked it into the spine of my notebook, where he wouldn't look, and kept walking like a model student. In the afternoon, I opened my locker and found another slip. Your story matters. No signature, no symbol. I smiled barely. My story wouldn't just be a survival story. It would be a formula. Evidence, plus witness, plus secure conduit, plus right timing. I had 3 terms. The last timing would come if I was patient. That night, as I swapped a few of my mother's pills for identical-looking vitamins, I heard him on the phone in the living room. Friday, as usual, he laughed. Bring the usual goods. Poker keeps a schedule. So does corruption. I looked over at my mother. Something thin and bright flashed in her eyes. I set my hand on the back of hers and whispered, I'm gathering the pieces, Mom. And in my head, I could already see the poker table lit up, the cards face down, and a pair of cold handcuffs waiting somewhere outside the door. Chapter 6. A Bridge. Out of the cage. Sometimes to get out, you don't pick a lock, you find who's holding the key. The card that said, Federal Building. Room 342 lay pressed against my notebook spine all day like a pulse. I needed a clean, channel one that didn't pass through clubhouse handshakes. In computer class, I opened the machine like any good kid 10-finger typing drill spreadsheet practice. In a tiny tab, I logged into a burner inbox I'd made long ago, not linked to any phone number. I typed exactly 3 words, evidence available. Urgent. The reply came in minutes, just 1-line dead drop at the supermarket, Mom and Mrs. Nakamura, frequent organic pasta aisle, gift card envelope, no direct contact, short, cold, professional. I appreciated the cold. That afternoon, Melissa wasn't in class. Family matter, the teacher said. No one asked more. I looked at the empty seat and understood someone had tightened her particular screw. A week stretched like a taut string until the custodian drifted close while sweeping the hall. This is for you, he murmured, eyes still on the floor. A small USB sat in a crumpled tissue. I palmed it, walked straight to the restroom, locked a stall, and opened it on my phone with the adapter I always kept hidden in my shirt pocket. Screenshots of texts, compressed audio clips, bank statements. The judge's name jumped across the lines, appointments fees, files from guided reunification cases. One file was flagged Yamamoto, 10,000. I swallowed. This was the key. Problem was getting it through the house. When I got home, I headed for the bathroom like someone who needed to wash up. Mom's tampon box sat under the sink, a place his brand of masculinity had never touched. The USB dropped to the bottom with the smallest little click. I washed my hands for a long time, as if any soap could rinse what I'd just done. At dinner, he talked reunification chore lists, timetables, the benefits of discipline. Mom nodded like a bobblehead. When he stepped to the living room to answer a call, I glanced at the pill lineup. I'd already started swapping a few for identical-looking vitamins, enough that this morning her eyes had managed to meet mine for a second. But he's sharp. By morning, he'd phoned Dr. Harrison to adjust the regimen. I needed to be a step ahead. We're out of things, I said while washing dishes, aiming for ordinary pasta milk toilet paper. And I looked at Mom feminine products. He looked up, narrowed his eyes a little, then nodded. Tomorrow after school? At school, I swung by the library. The substitute, Ms. Chen, did the edge-of-cover fingertip touch when she took my book. I answered with the pencil tap. When you write your essay, remember proper citation format. She said, stressing format, then slipped me a harmless-looking handout. how to cite sources, how to make a bibliography. At the bottom, a tiny blot like smeared ink, the little book symbol Mrs. Nakamura uses. I slid the sheet into my notebook and felt like I was crossing a rope bridge between two cliffs, swaying thin, but a bridge. The next afternoon, he parked at the supermarket and told me to go with Mom while he listened to the radio. I pushed the cart. She walked beside me, steps unsteady, but eyes clearer than in days. "What do we need?" she asked very softly. "Pasta," I said, "the organic kind." She nodded, repeating it like a lesson, organic. We reached aisle 7. In front of us, a forest of beige-green boxes, all nearly identical. I took a Gap gift card envelope, slid the USB inside, sealed it like a present for someone. The envelope slipped into the gap behind a middle-row pasta box where the ceiling camera would have the worst view. I rolled the card away. At the end of the aisle stood a woman reading a nutrition label, hair neatly tied. She didn't look at me, didn't touch Mom, but a few minutes later as we turned into dairy, I glanced back and saw the pasta shelf just slightly more empty. I exhaled. Mom whispered, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing an essay." "A different kind." She looked at me longer than usual, then gave a very slight nod. Back home, the camera app lit the rooms up again. He replayed footage from the kitchen and living room, checked the locks, even checked my shoes. "Off," he said, and I took them off. The USB hadn't been there since yesterday, but his search routine still made my soles sweat. He ran a flashlight along the seams, then patted my shoulder, a reward for cooperation. I went to my room, shut the door, sat at the desk. The countdown ticked like a sawtooth. If everything blew up, I still had one more piece. Mom's cloud video, the Room 342 card, the library mark, and Friday poker, Melissa's accidental roadmap. I wondered where she was, where they'd sent her, what words she'd been told to say. I wrote her name on my notebook margin and drew a thin line through it like a promise to remember. 3 days of waiting stretched into a week. He tightened control more interior locks, shoe checks, before and after school seams, inspected backpack seams too. Mom grew clear, and then foggy again to the rhythm of pills and appointments. I kept the look-alike vitamin swaps steady enough that her hand shook less when she held a spoon. The night before Friday, he called and laughed as usual. I heard his friends chuckle over the speaker glasses clinking. Poker has a sound all its own. Friday dawned clear. I went to school, like always turned work in on time, nodded at the right moments. In chemistry, Melissa's seat was still empty. We did neutralization acid, dropped into base until the color changed, one of those moments when a single drop flips the whole beaker to another shade. I watched the solution and thought about a door that would change color tonight. Evening came. He knotted a tie, sprayed cologne, and set Beethoven just loud enough for the neighbors to compliment his taste. I sat at my desk, eyes on my notebook, ears tuned to the house's smallest noise. When the countdown hit D0, the lock clicked. I didn't sleep. I counted each car rolling past outside, each headlight, sweeping the curtains each minute, stretching like hard candy. Somewhere in the city, an envelope had hit the right hands, a list of names had been read, and a team in jackets that say U.S. Marshals was pulling on gloves and checking radios. I didn't know exactly when they'd knock on whose door. I only knew I'd pushed a rock over the edge. And when it hit the poker table, the crack would sound like a different kind of music. Not Beethoven, but metal cuffs meeting. Chapter 7, Poker Night and the Sound of Handcuffs. Friday arrived like a test to see whether the rock I'd pushed off the slope would actually roll. He tightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, sprayed cologne, and put on Beethoven just loud enough for the neighbors to call it taste. I sat at my desk, eyes glued to my notebook, ears stretched taut like a drum. At 9 o'clock, the lock on my door gave a click. I didn't sleep. I counted cars sliding past the house, counted headlights sweeping the curtains, counted minutes oozing by like syrup. Near midnight, Beethoven cut off. The TV clicked on. The volume wasn't high, but the word breaking still sliced through the door. I sat up, held my breath. The anchor read slowly as if counting marbles. Federal authorities arrested a local judge on suspicion of bribery in child custody cases. The footage showed a kitchen blazing with light, a poker table mid-game, a few faces washed pale by camera flash. Some were handcuffed, some hid their faces. A woman screamed, and a federal officer gently moved her aside. Out in the living room, the sofa let out a short squeak he'd shifted. The phone buzzed on the table once, twice, three times, then stopped. He dialed out. No one answered. He tried another number. Again, no answer. I pictured phones buzzing all at once in the pockets of his poker friends while their owners were busy signing seizure inventories. I heard a glass set down hard slippers scraping across wood. A window opened. Smoke. I parted the curtain. The fireplace was roaring in midsummer. Papers went in like white butterflies, bills, photos, envelopes. He held a thick file, hesitated for a second, then tossed it into the fire. Flame reflected on his face, hardening it like a statue starting to crack. With each page that burned, I could read another letter of Panic Network web snapped. The next morning, he got up earlier than usual. No Beethoven, just the clatter of keys. He changed his phone password, reset the camera codes, and made a loop through the house like an officer reviewing troops. From today, he said, as he put breakfast down, the interior locks will be set to automatic as well. The bathroom door got a new bolt. The kitchen door got a sensor. He checked my shoes. Before we left, ran his hand along my backpack. Seams flashed a light into every pocket. Finding nothing, he managed a strict but fair father smile. It slid off his face like it couldn't stick. At school, the news had spread. No one said it out loud, but the student whispernet moves faster than any official channel. Melissa's dad. Someone murmured, then fell silent when I passed. Melissa's seat was still empty. I looked at that gap and thought of the USB tucked in a gift card envelope, now probably sealed in an evidence bag accompanied by a signature that had appeared on last night's news. In chemistry, teachers changed their tune. No more talk of second chances. No more smiles held a beat too long when their eyes landed on me. Some avoided my gaze as if looking too long might make the truth shoot out of my pupils. In the library, Ms. Chen handed me a newly checked out book. Her fingertip brushed the edge of the cover twice, very lightly. I answered with a tap of my pencil. No one noticed, but I felt the rope bridge sway a little less. That afternoon, he picked me up late. His dress shirt was rumpled tie loosened half a hand's width. He said he'd been busy with company matters without blinking. At home, the fireplace flared again, though the heat had the air conditioner groaning. He brought out a wooden box from his study, old documents, event invitations, donor lists, the sort of thing adults call relationships. I stood in my doorway and watched the fire eat the names that had blocked me at court. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear, not the kind he used to teach me discipline. That night, I didn't count cars. I counted news hits. Each news segment was another nail driven deeper into my story, payouts and custody cases, recordings, bank statements, and investigation months in the making. The word network appeared on the screen, and not because I'd drawn it. Witness 2. I shut my eyes and saw Melissa's face on a deposition camera, speaking slow and clear, the way you read element names from the periodic table. I didn't know where she was, but I knew this. She had pushed a piece far heavier than I ever could. Sunday morning, someone knocked. Not his friends, not neighbors. Federal agents. They presented paperwork, read rights, requested seizure of certain devices. He kept an air of calm cooperation, voice smooth as ever. Of course, for the good of the community. When they left, his hands shook enough that the key ring slipped. I bent to pick it up. Just a second, but the head of the new basement lock key flashed bright in the sunlight. That evening, my mother's phone rang. A polite female voice invited her for a reevaluation at the court's request. I looked at the line of pill bottles these past days. I'd swapped a few for identical vitamins. And today, her gaze held clarity a little longer. Under the table, she squeezed my hand lightly, like someone remembering a movement they'd forgotten. Monday, a notice went up on the courthouse board. An emergency hearing would be set. A judge from another district was assigned. I recited that line in my head, like a lab result. The solution changed color not by luck, but because the drops were added in the right order. Back home, he paced like an animal in a cage too small, made calls until his voice went hoarse, each sentence ending with, "We'll get through this," with whom I didn't know. To me, he no longer said a whole family. He said, compliance, schedule, monitoring. Those keywords clanged against each other in the spotless kitchen. At night, I lay there watching the red dot on the ceiling. I thought of the night I slid out the basement window, the screws, the metal squeal, the cold, damp lawn. This time the window had opened another way, an envelope behind the pasta shelf, a mark in the library, a USB in a tampon box, the 11 p.m. newscast, a federal knock. Small things joined into a path out. I didn't know which day the emergency hearing would fall on. I only knew the poker table was folded away. Melissa's seat remained empty, and the fear on his face had finally taken shape. I pulled the blanket up and whispered as before, "I'm still breathing." But this time I added a new line, and the story has gone beyond this house. Chapter 8. The House of Cards starts to collapse. From the night the breaking banner aired, his house seemed to shrink. The spotless white walls that had been the backdrop for a model family now echoed with hurried footsteps and the clicks of newly added locks. He didn't play Beethoven anymore. He listened to silence, the kind of music that makes you hear your own fear. In the morning, he ran a key ring check, like a troop review. The bathroom door got another bolt, the kitchen, another sensor, a new padlock appeared on the backyard fence. He set breakfast down with a pasted-on smile. Discipline helps you feel safe. I nodded like a machine, learning to nod. Under the table, my mother's hand squeezed mine for the first time. Her eyes held a clearer light now, thanks to the vitamins I'd swapped in for a few days. I thought about the clinic, the reevaluation at the court's request already on the calendar. If she could speak, our story would gain another adult voice. At school, the student whisper network moved like electricity. No one said anything outright, but wherever I went, the word judge walked half a step ahead of me and poker half a step behind. Melissa's chair remained empty. In chemistry, the teacher assigned a quiet lab. As we cleaned up the substitute librarian, Ms. Chen passed the classroom door, her fingertip tapping the window frame 3 times. I answered with 2 short and 1 long pencil taps on the desk. There were adults posted where they needed to be. At lunch, I sat at the supervision table right under a camera. My tray looked like a catalog spread diagonally cut sandwich shining apple granola bar in a straight line. I broke off a corner of bread, heard the dry crackle of the crust, and chewed like chewing paper. At the teacher's table, the counselor looked my way for a second longer than usual, then wrote something in her notebook. I guessed stable, cooperative, adapted. Pretty words, always know how to hide bruises you can't photograph. In the afternoon, the courthouse board carried a notice emergency hearing judge from another county. I read it over and over the way you read a lab result, whose color you already expect when the reagent is enough the solution shifts tone. In the hall, an administrator slipped busy, weak reporters and prosecutors in and out all day. I walked past just as I ran into the school paper reporter. He didn't speak. He glanced at my shoes, the place where a USB had once been, then back up a small nod. No language needed. We were people who lived by signals. At home, the fireplace still burned. He threw in what adults call relationships, invitations, donor lists, country club photos. each page curled in the heat like a bridge burned behind him. I leaned on the doorframe and watched the flames lick across a familiar name, Harrison, before it vanished into smoke. He turned and caught me looking. The smile rose on his face like a machine. "Don't worry, this will pass." But at the corners of his eyes there was no curve of calm, only the sharp angle of panic. At night, my door clicked at 9 as always. I lay still under the red dot on the ceiling and practiced answers for court in my head. My name, my age, what the basement looked like, how I climbed out the window, what happened after reunification. I laid out the timeline, Amber Alert in the library, the search warrant, the first set of handcuffs, the courtroom, the reunification order, the new house cameras, locks, pills, poker, Marshals, one continuous flow, no gaps for a lawyer to hook a question into. I wasn't planning to tell a tragedy. I was planning to present a chain reaction. The next day, the feds came back to seize more devices. He tried a joke. "These are for protecting my family," but his hands shook enough to drop his pen. They didn't laugh. When they left, my mother called me into the kitchen and set an appointment card in front of me. "Come with me." She said a sentence whole from start to finish, like a road without potholes. I nodded. I would sit beside her, watch the doctor write each word, watch her tell it. I would be the eyes that remember what the drugs erased. The day after the school board lifted the temporary suspension on Mrs. Nakamura. She stepped through the library doorway to a tiny exhale from the kids who sit quietly in corners. She took in the room, then me. No hug, no tears. She simply set her hand on the checkout counter for 3 seconds. I set mine down too, on the same spot. "I've been appointed your academic support," she said, as if announcing a new checkout. "Until this is over." "Yes," I answered, like returning a book on time. That evening, he began training me. How to sit straight, how to call him Dad, how to tell a story in which every detail sounds reasonable. Each time I drifted, his hand tightened around my wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but enough to remind me who held the key. "Our family needs to be united," he said, the proverb of people who've just burned a bundle of evidence. I repeated it, like memorizing a wrong formula. Between rounds of training, I swapped a few more of my mother's pills. Enough that the next morning, she remembered whether she'd eaten breakfast, remembered her doctor's name, remembered he hadn't been home on Friday night. She looked at me and whispered, "You're doing something, aren't you?" "I'm taking notes." I said, "So tomorrow, I can read them out loud for the right people." On the last night before the emergency hearing, I slept hardly at all. I reread every sign that had brought me here. The "Your Story Matters" slip the pencil tap, the USB hidden in the tampon box, the envelope behind the pasta shelf, the 11 p.m. broadcast the Marshals, knock my mother's appointment card, the notice judge from another county. Each one a rung on a ladder no one could see. And in the morning, that ladder would touch the courtroom floor. Before lights out, he stood in the doorway, his hand on the frame, like the first night after reunification. "Tomorrow you just need to tell the truth," he said, his voice sweet as sticky candy. "The truth is, you were paranoid and ran away. You'll apologize. Everyone loves you." I nodded, eyes fixed on the red dot above. When the door closed, I breathed out my real answer, only loud enough for the blanket to hear. "Tomorrow I will tell the truth, but it will be my truth." The morning of the hearing was clear as freshly washed glass. I wore the plaid shirt my foster family bought, buttoned it slowly because my hands shook. On the drive, he talked about the schedule after we win. I counted streetlights, each one a breath. Outside the courtroom, I saw the federal prosecutor, a few reporters' faces that didn't belong to his club. The librarian stood in the back row, hands clasped. My mother sat beside me, her eyes bright, her hands warm. When the clerk called all rise, I stood, my heart beating at exactly the tempo I'd practiced in my head. The back door opened. The new judge walked in, no photos on his walls, no fishing trophies, no Sunday cocktails, only a gavel and eyes that looked straight. I knew that if there was ever a moment for the story to chapter 9, the hearing that flipped the script. When the new judge entered the room, fell into the kind of silence that has weight. No group photos, no fishing trophies, no social smiles. Only eyes that looked straight and a voice that made people sit up. I squeezed my mother's hand under the table. Her hand was warm, steady. The doctor had adjusted her medication. For the first time in years, I heard my mother's breathing instead of the sound of drugs dragging her words to the bottom. The federal prosecutor opened as cleanly as drawing a blade from its sheath. This is no longer a family dispute, he said, but a question of a child's safety and the integrity of the system. I heard the word system and thought of the poker table, the handshakes, the fireplace swallowing paper. My mother was called first. She stood and drew a small breath. Her voice wasn't smooth, but it was clear. She spoke of falls that had no stairs, of nights hearing the basement lock slide back into place, of the damp smell of concrete clinging to my hair. She spoke about the medication, the drug names, the increased doses, the appointments with Harrison, and how it turned her into a living witness with no voice. When she said I left my son down there, her head dipped and then rose again, as if gripping her own hair to pull herself out of the water. I watched the judge take notes, missing nothing. Next was the clerk from the earlier hearing. She read line by line from the minutes, her voice even as a ruler. She described the moment he squeezed my wrist under the table, how the camera panned past and no one spoke, how the conflict of interest form was left blank like a taunt. I was wrong to stay silent, she said, eyes finding me, and today I correct that. I gave the smallest nod. Some adults learn courage late, but still in time. The screen came on. Melissa appeared in the frame of another room. Tired face, dark circles, but words cut cleanly. She spoke about poker, about envelopes, about numbers paired with names. She said my name once, just once enough to place us on the same line. I recognize that fear, she said, because it lives in my house. I heard dry swallows from the row behind. His attorney tried to hoist the whole story with words like impulsive, troubled teen paranoid. But then the forensic physician presented photos and x-rays, healed fractures, circular marks like cigarette tips, bruises placed exactly where they would be invisible in long sleeves. There was no room left in the courtroom for denial dressed up as euphemism. Then it was my turn. I stood and pulled up my sleeve. Cold light slid across old scars and fresh bruises. I described the basement cold floor, musty air, the bucket in the corner. I described the new house cameras in every corner, a countdown clock, an automatic door bolt, windows painted tight as concrete. I spoke about the soundproof music room with no music about Beethoven used like a heavy curtain. I didn't shout or cry. I recited an experiment I'd run many times, and this time someone listened. When I said exactly 2 words, soundproof, room, his mask fell off. He lurched to his feet, voice cracking open, and spat words about ungrateful fabrications treatment. 2 bailiffs moved as quickly as the room's reflex. For a moment I saw his hand start to land on someone's shoulder, right pressure, right spot, right habit, then hang in midair, caught. Everyone saw the person under the varnish of strict father. The judge took less than 10 minutes to read the order. Immediate termination of custody, he said, and referral for criminal prosecution on child endangerment, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. He turned to me. Temporary placement with your mother with supervision and continued treatment per medical recommendations. The current foster family will continue to assist. I heard the word continue, and a library door opened in my mind. Handcuffs sounded behind me like a metal note struck at perfect pitch. He looked back at me as he passed. No smile, only eyes with nowhere to land when there was no frame left to perform to. I didn't look down. In the hallway, Mrs. Nakamura was waiting, a new badge on her chest. Academic advisor, education advocate. She opened her arms, didn't hug, just set a hand on my shoulder. This time I didn't flinch. She said, "Today we checked out a book on justice. Tomorrow you'll return it with grades and by helping someone else check it out." I smiled the kind of smile that lets your chest rise. My mother cried in the car. Not the crying of drugs, but of someone with real tears. She said she was sorry, then quiet then. "Thank you for not leaving me." I looked out the window at a sky so normal it was blinding. "Just don't leave me anymore," I said, and believed it. The way you believe an equation that's been verified. In the afternoon, my foster parents texted, "Your room here is always ready on weekends. The cactus you forgot is still alive, doing great." I read "still alive" over and over like a charm. At the library, Ms. Chen handed me a sheet with hotline numbers and the address for room 342, in case she said, and no one heard the "in case," tucked between two calm words. That evening, I set my backpack on the floor of a house with windows that open. The breeze lifted the curtains. The medicine smell in the kitchen wasn't heavy anymore. My mother opened a cupboard, took out 2 bowls, and asked what I wanted for dinner. The question was so ordinary I had to inhale before answering. I washed my hands and looked in the mirror. The boy, who crawled through a basement window, looked back at me through the steam, no longer in a rush. He nodded as if to say, "Good. On to the next part." That night, I opened my notebook and wrote at the top, "Survival is not the end of the story." Then I added, "Tomorrow I'll go to the library at lunch. There are kids wearing coats in summer who need to know how to hide a USB and how to find adults who tap twice on a book's edge." I turned off the light. There was no click from any lock. Only the wind and my heartbeat in the place it's meant to be. Chapter 10. Survival is only the openings. 6 months later, I sat at the wooden table by the library window, right where the noon sun slants in. Mrs. Nakamura set down a tray of fruit and said, "Eat first, then be a savior." I bit into an orange segment. The sweet sour pulled me back to the present. No cameras on the ceiling, no countdown clock, no self-locking doors. Only the rustle of pages and the smell of old books. My mother went to therapy as regularly as a temple bell. She learned to speak full sentences without having them sink to the bottom under the medication. I learned to trust each sentence a little day by day. On weekends, my foster parents invited me over for dinner, asked about schoolwork, told me the cactus I'd left behind now had 3 new arms. Every time I got home, I opened my bedroom window wide, as if to remind myself, this glass opens. The sentence for him 15 years came on an overcast morning. I didn't feel instantly lighter. Justice is never like hitting a mute button. It's like turning down a terrible song, little by little, until you realize you can hear your own voice. I stood on the steps outside the library and took a deep breath. Cool wind. No smell of smoke. Melissa sent a short email. No address, no details, just one sentence: "We did the right thing." At the end was the periodic table icon she once drew for me. I replied, "Thank you for sharing the bridge." Then I deleted the message, not out of fear, but because some things are complete only when you let them go. Other kids started finding me. Not by rushing up and spilling everything, but through signals. Adults rarely notice long sleeves in mid-June eating lunch against a wall, a flinch at the sound of a latch. I didn't ask what's going on. I asked, "Do you want to learn chemistry?" And between formulas, we talked about how to take notes. Photograph the serial number on a lock. Photograph a window thick with paint. Record dates and times by tucking a tiny calendar page into a picture frame and taking a photo. Write one simple line each night on the back of a worksheet. Today, 9:03 door, locked. 9. 15 footsteps. 9:30. Silence. Enough to build a timeline. I kept a pocket calculator with a secret compartment on hand, not to hide a USB anymore, but to stash emergency numbers written on glossy paper: social services, the hotline, the federal office in room 342, and the names of safe adults in school. Ms. Chen at the checkout desk adopted Mrs. Nakamura's signal, 2 taps of her fingertip on a book's edge when receiving it, and I'd answer with a pencil tap. Gradually, other teachers learned the sign too. No oath required, just a readiness to step forward when called. A younger boy sat across from me at lunch, pretending to ask about acid-base reactions. I showed him how to drip just enough for the solution to change color at the right moment, then slid him a small note. If you need to find Ms. N or the counseling office, don't go alone. He nodded, eyes on his pile of notebooks, but fingers gripping the slip like a life ring. Sometimes the system still skipped a beat. Now and then someone in an office said, "Family matter, don't get involved." Then I put the file I'd prepared, photos, timestamps, contact names on the table like a test tube changing color. I learned there are 2 kinds of adults: those who need evidence in order to be brave, and those who are already brave. Both are useful as long as you give them what they need. Some days, I went home early and passed by the old house. The fence was the same. The maple out front still cast its shadow on the steps. I stopped at the sidewalk and didn't go in. The basement window along the side sat lower than I remembered. I imagined the squeal of metal when the screws gave the damp grass brushing my sleeves, my heartbeat rising above Beethoven. I smiled just a little. The boy from that night had done his part. The rest was mine now. Mom cooked a simple dinner: miso soup, scrambled eggs, hot rice. I washed the dishes, she wiped the table, and then we sat and read each with our own book. At the last page, she looked up. "When do you think we'll stop being afraid?" I said. "Probably never. But the fear will learn to sit in its proper seat." She nodded like someone who's finally found the right chair. At lunchtime, there were always a few familiar shadows in the library. I set up a resources corner disguised as a chemistry outline, how to store evidence safely, a list of phone numbers, little tricks that leave no marks on your body. For example, keep a journal in pencil, photograph it, then erase it, or record audio during English listening practice, setting the headphones on the desk so the mic sits close to the source. I always ended with this: don't do anything alone. Always give the information to a safe adult at school first. The best victory is the one that doesn't need a window. At night, I opened my bedroom window and let the wind push the curtains like a lung. I thought of the names that pulled me across Mrs. Nakamura tapping twice on the counter, Ms. Chen tucking the hotline list into a citation guide, the court clerk admitting her silence, the school reporter slipping the paper with room 342 into my hand, the foster family keeping a bed ready and a well-behaved cactus alive, and Melissa, who placed a USB on the scales of justice. Tomorrow, surely another kid will drift into the library, shoulders caved as if carrying stones. I'll hand them a pen, a piece of paper, a glass of water, and the most ordinary question: what period do you have after lunch? Inside that question is a promise. You don't have to crawl through a window alone. Before bed, I wrote in my notebook, "Survival is the opening act. The rest is teaching one another how to open doors." I closed the notebook and turned off the light. There was no click, only wind leaves and a city where, if you listen long enough, you can hear window latches popping open one by one. Justice doesn't switch on overnight. It's a series of small steps: a slip of paper noting lock, times a USB hidden in a tampon box, 2 taps on the edge of a book. My stepfather got 15 years. The windows in my house open now. And every lunch hour, I sit in the library teaching kids how to preserve evidence and find a safe adult. If you're in Mrs. Nakamura's or Melissa's position, would you dare tap twice on the book's edge to say, "I'm here"? And if you're where I was at 13, don't be alone. Tell someone today. If this story resonates, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it, and follow the channel so you don't miss the next true Reddit stories. We can't fix the past, but we can open a few more windows for those who come after.